Hey there everybody, welcome to the Baba Yaga project. This is our very first YouTube video. It's January 1st here in Montreal, and it's definitely the middle of winter. I personally love the winter. I think it's a wonderful, dark, sleepy time in which we can reflect. And this month, January, in fact, is named after the god Janus, who's the god of two faces, one to look forward and one to look back. And that makes this really the perfect time to reflect on the past and look forward to the future. And New Year's Day is one of my favorite parts of my winter traditions, and I wanted to start off this video series that we're starting here with a traditional New Year's practice from my home region in the southern United States. So why don't you follow me along as I make a New Year's Day dinner, and we can talk about the history of food in the South and the particular significance of this meal specifically. So many, if not most cultures, have a sort of traditional food they consume at the beginning of the year. The meanings may be as different as the foods that are served, but generally these traditions are meant to usher in a bountiful and healthful year. This meal specifically is comprised of traditional southern dishes that each signify a special wish for the coming year. Of what I'm making here, the most well-known dish on our plates tonight will be hoppinjon, a particular way of preparing black-eyed peas that are supposed to represent the bounty of coins that will come to you in the new year. Or at least that's what my mother told me. Every year she would also prepare collard greens for cash money, pork for our health, and saffron rice for gold. My bank account would suggest that this is not actually the best way to ensure that you have funds for the year. But now that I live in Canada, and I spent a not small amount of time realizing that if you want collard greens in Montreal, you have to be a restaurant that is willing to special order them, and saffron, which is pricey in Charlotte, is unbelievably expensive here. So instead of what my mom traditionally makes, I will be substituting out a fancy kale substitute and replacing our yellow rice with a crumbly cornbread. I want to take a moment while we cozy up in the kitchen to talk about the history of the food that I'm preparing. Like most things in North America, food in the South has a complex and difficult history. What has come out of it is a food that has influences from Europe, West Africa, and indigenous North America. What we think of now as Southern food or soul food or African American heritage cooking has come out of a deeply troubling history of slavery, plantations, and extreme poverty. Europeans arriving in North America developed a complicated relationship with the corn indigenous people were quick to help them grow. A central crop to the North American diet, European settlers looked down on the coarse grain in favor of the fine wheat that they had brought with them. Wheat doesn't grow well on the east coast of North America, though, and very poorly in the south, and Europeans were forced to accept their dependence on the grain. By the 17th century, it was a staple crop across all the populations of the East Coast. And this was among the other crops that also made up the Three Sisters, squashes, and climbing beans. The Three Sisters is how these three crops were known in indigenous communities, the way that they supported themselves in growing and were mutually beneficial to that particular type of agriculture lent them to the idea of being depicted as sisters. You can also check out our podcast episode about the Three Sisters on our website. The Atlantic slave trade, which would reach its height in the next century, and the development of what would become known as the Atlantic world, introduced a new element to the mix that was becoming quote-unquote American cooking. In the South, plantation cooks were creating the cuisine. Nearly all of these cooks were enslaved people, making food from recipes that had been taught to them by family and neighbors and from whatever formal training they might have had. I want to share the story of a particular cook who has influenced the American palate in ways that really can't be underestimated. James Hemings was the brother of Sally Hemings and was enslaved by Thomas Jefferson, a founding father of the United States. He was one of Thomas Jefferson's cooks, and when he was a young man, Jefferson brought him to France. Technically, upon landing in France, Heming was freed, but his family ties at Monticello kept him from fleeing Jefferson's enslavement. At quote unquote at great expense, Jefferson had him tutored in French and apprenticed at the best kitchens in Paris and Versailles. By the time they returned to Virginia, James Hemings was America's best educated and trained chef. He could read and write in multiple languages, which was essentially unheard of for an enslaved Virginian at the time. Many of the dishes we now credit Thomas Jefferson with introducing to the American palate can also be credited to James Hemings. While Jefferson certainly oversaw the runnings of his kitchen and contributed ideas to what he wanted served, it was the culinary expertise of James Hemings that combined his French training with African techniques and indigenous American ingredients. We can thank him for American mac and cheese. James Hemings was the best trained and most influential chef of his era, but his blend of skills was not unique. Cooks across the South were trained in European methods that they combined with the knowledge of their grandparents and the crops harvested for generations by the indigenous people of that land. I want to share here a particular story about traditional beliefs around cooking that comes from this history. I found this while reading up for this video in Michael Twitty's book, The Cooking Gene. You should all check that out, it's really good. But in it he says, quote, "Pots have souls, at least that's what I'm told. Pots are to African and African diaspora mythology what bottles are to genies in the Middle East. They are like shells for hermit crabs. The pots contain wisdom and the dead. If you don't treat them right, you might just watch one run off down the road." End quote. I especially like this idea because all of the cookware you see us using here came from either my family or my husband's, and we do try to take care of it well, mostly by using it all often. So I have a complicated relationship with the history of the food that I grew up with, and with this food that I'm making here. I am clearly, from this video, a white woman. My family was from Scotland before we made our way to the Highlands of North Carolina and down to Georgia. While I haven't found a record of enslaving in my direct ancestors, the culture in which they lived and the foodways they passed down are those steeped in racism, legacies of American chattel slavery. When I make these foods, I'm trying to do so while holding a place for everyone that was a part of the creation of this culinary tradition, especially those held in bondage and those of the South Georgia farms and Appalachian Hills who sustained their family on these affordable crops and the hope for a better future. Our history in the South is not segregated. The culture has always been a dance of many partners, with a majority of these contributions coming from those who have labored without credit. This is one of the hard things about studying and engaging with the past. It's complicated and often really hard, but ultimately rewarding. In this video series, we want to explore historic lifeways and seasonal traditions. Our understanding of history is a complex negotiation. History is not a straight line of progress to an ever better world, but the past is also not universally bad. We hope that this year we're able to learn a bit about historic practices, their context, and how we might bring them into our lives today and create a more sustainable and seasonal life. So, as we make this meal, I want to remember all of the enslaved cooks who crafted the Southern food culture and my mama who taught it to me. So here we are, we've made some food and learned some history. Let's sit down to eat. Across the world, we're all getting ready for a new year with goals and hopes and dreams for what will be in coming seasons. Sonia and I want to take a moment with you to reflect on the usefulness of things like New Year's resolutions. As we move into this series, we are trying to learn what practices and traditions we want to bring into our lives. We hope that this is how you think about your resolutions. Rather than looking back and seeing all the ways that you have failed to live up to some expectation, we hope that you take this moment, maybe also around a table with friends, to think about the things that would bring you joy in the new year and how you can implement them in your life. At this time of year, we can really be under a pressure to follow that old adage, new year, new me. But we can also take this time to reflect and decide what we want to change and what we want to keep. Here, our table is set with an intentional meal made with a connection to those who are with us and those who can't be right now. The practices we choose for the new year are going to be more of the same activities and crafts and traditions that bring us more community, more peace, and a deeper understanding of our history. And we really hope that you join us. But for now, cheers to a new year.